All right, history. We are finishing up chapter 14, section 3. So again, William and Mary are invited to become rulers at the end of the 17th century. And they drew up this Bill of Rights. And again, I'd encourage you to pause here and just quickly read through this. And hopefully, if you know the American Bill of Rights, you'll see how much of this derives from this. So anyway, it's worth knowing the connection there as you get into U.S. history in a couple of years. And again, we're no longer having dynastic succession. It's going to be the parliament. Now, granted, there's still dynasties. You know, we're going to move from the Stuart dynasty to the Hanover dynasty, and then we're going to have the dynasty that's the House of Windsor. That's the current. So it's not like this goes away. It's just that it has to be approved now. There's no just automatic right that a family is going to have it. And so again, this is what we mean by talking about a constitutional monarchy as opposed to an autocratic one or merely a dynastic one. So Queen Anne, and then it goes to the House of Hanover, and of course we're gonna hear about the House of Hanover when we talk about George III. So, and then we talk about a cabinet system. And you know, you may be aware of the presidential cabinet, right? There's a Secretary of Defense, there's a Secretary of State that interacts with other nations, there's a Secretary of Commerce. Well, in Europe, these are called ministers. So you've got a Minister of Defense, you've got a Foreign Minister who's like our Secretary of State, and then you've got a Prime Minister. And eventually, what's going to happen is these guys are going to actually be elected, or you'll elect the prime minister, and then he'll choose, just like we elect a president, and he chooses all the secretaries, all the cabinet. So again, it's a more representative, democratic move that we're going to see. George I left affairs of government in the hands of his chief minister, and so he's going to become known as the prime minister, and he'll increasingly have the power. And so when we think of the leader of Great Britain today, it's not really Queen Elizabeth II, it's Boris Johnson, who is the current elected prime minister. And that prime minister, unlike our president, whenever Parliament, you know, a majority gets Parliament, that leader becomes the prime minister. So it's not like a set 4-year term like it is in our government. So anyway, there's changes that can happen quickly in a parliamentary system. There's a picture of William and Mary. And again, there's a college in Virginia, I believe, named after them. So I would encourage you here to pause and briefly talk through the section review. I'm just going to skip through it real quick. So we've talked about how these countries, and again, we're primarily talking about France, right? Section 1. Section 2, we talked about Austria, Prussia, Russia. And then section 3, we talked about England and how it charts a different path. And eventually these other countries are going to become more like that as democracy flourishes more in the 20th century. So how do these countries interact with each other? And that's what this last section is about, is the fact that there's several wars that happened in the 18th century as these countries, particularly Prussia, France, Austria, and England, are achieving greater and greater power, growth of nationalism. They've got these large standing armies, and so they use them. Okay, and so that's what this last section. What was the significance of the balance of power in Europe? What were the outcomes of the War of Spanish Succession and the War of Austrian Succession? And again, succession is about, who becomes the ruler afterwards. If there's not a clear um, process of succession, like in our country, if the president dies, then the vice president becomes the president. That's our policy of succession, so that we don't end up having a big fight about it. Of course, if both of them died at the same time, then there's a whole series. It goes to the Speaker of the House and on and on and on. What caused the 7 Years' War? And again, if you remember your US history, it's called the French and Indian War over here. So the balance of power. Nations formed alliances, okay? And sometimes they would switch because they wanted to make sure that they kept their power and no one other nation would dominate. So sometimes they might change their loyalty because they felt like, such and such power was gaining too much, and so they would break off their alliance with them and go elsewhere. So the three major wars, again, Spanish Succession, Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, demonstrate how these things work. So the War of Spanish Succession. The beginning of the 18th century, the Habsburg King of Spain died, and so his will said that he wanted to grant his power to his nephew, Philip, and Louis XIV sees this as an opportunity. And remember, Louis XIV, he's a long-ruled ruler. He's going to die shortly after this war is over, but he's continuing to want to assert his power. So he sees an opportunity, and the other nations of Europe are fearful of this. So the other nations, England and Netherlands, are fearful of this union that's going to come about. So they form the Grand Alliance. And the armies of the Grand Alliance are largely successful in stopping. So even though, Louis had this large army, he doesn't appear to have the best generals. So they win at Blenheim. England captures Gibraltar, which is right on the southern tip. It's basically, the entryway from the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean Sea, and it's this little spot that even still today is part of Great Britain. It's not Spanish. It's right across from Morocco. So this Treaty of Utrecht, which was the result of this, Philip was allowed to become king, but could not unite with his grandfather. Spain, which had been involved in the Netherlands, right? There was a rebellion that the Netherlands had against Spain all the way back in the 16th century. Anyway, Spain has to give up certain of its possessions. Again, this is about maintaining the balance of power. And then Britain was able to take over certain territories in the New World. And of course, 50 years later, they're going to end up taking over all of New France. So here at the top of page 312, we have the War of the Austrian Succession. So this is a conflict that's going to be taking place on 3 continents. So we're virtually getting to world wars before the, I think part of the reason why World War I is called World War I, right, from 100 years ago, is because America has become the great country of the New World, and it's involved in it. But when you look at how far-reaching some of these 18th century wars are, they're virtually world wars. Anyway, so the Emperor of Austria is trying to set things up so that his daughter, Maria Theresa, won't be taken down by these neighbors. Again, neighbors like Prussia, neighbors like German states, neighbors like France. Okay, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a large empire. You can see it on the map there, at the bottom of page 13. This orange section is very large territory. So the rulers of these neighboring territories signed it, but the Ninth Commandment, right? They didn't have any intention of honoring it, particularly this guy, Frederick II, um, who I believe we said was Frederick the Great back in section 2. He decided to try to seize the territory of Silesia because he wanted the natural resources there. And so Frederick invaded, and Prussia was largely successful in this. And so France also came in, and then Spain, and then Britain. Britain came in actually on the side of Austria because they're trying to hold back France. Britain and France are, constantly opponents in this time period. And again, that when we think back, that goes all the way back to the late Middle Ages when, British kings who were Norman were asserting their authority in France. And so this is a long-standing rivalry, and it's going to kind of climax in the Napoleonic era when we get to the 19th century. So anyway, so the war spreads to North America and to India, and eventually they get kind of exhausted. Sometimes these wars, there's no real clear victor. It's not like World War II, where there's a decisive victory against the Axis power. Sometimes you just kind of run out of gas and say it's better just to kind of go back. And you'll see this phrase here at the bottom of page, right above the 7 Years' War: status quo ante bellum. Okay, ante means before, bellum means war. So like the antebellum period in American is the period before the Civil War, right? 1607 up to 1860. The postbellum period is everything after 1865. Well, this is so the status quo is, what was it like before then? So we're basically just kind of resetting, going back to where it was. So in a sense, the war didn't really, obviously a lot of people died, and it tested the waters, but it didn't actually accomplish so much what the other countries wanted, except perhaps the Prussians gaining this territory of Silesia. Moving on a little bit later, we have the 7 Years' War. So this starts over in the New World in these Canadian territories and what's now New York and Pennsylvania. There was fighting taking place there. So now France, who had been warring with Austria in the previous war, now is joining with Austria in order to try to stop Prussia. So it says here they reverse course. So now the Austrians, the Austrians are joined with France, and so this is called the Diplomatic Revolution. and leads us into the 7 Years' War that starts in 1756. William Pitt the Elder, his son, is going to become one of the most important prime ministers a generation later. But anyway, the elder decides maybe they don't need to send a bunch of troops, but they can send money to Prussia to help them in their efforts against France. Okay, so sometimes you do direct war with actual soldiers. Sometimes you do more of an indirect war. Like for instance, in World War II, America was not in the war until we were attacked by Japan in December 7th, 1941, a date that shall live in infamy. Um, and so the first 2 years of the war, we're not even there, and yet we are there because we are supplying, we're kind of secretly supplying funds and resources to the British and even the Russians, the Soviets. So that's kind of what's going on here, where the English are, the British are siding with Prussia and group assistance. His strategy called for supplying Prussia financial aid and using this nation to keep French troops occupied in Europe. Meanwhile, Britain would attempt to destroy French sea power, making it easier to defeat the French in North America. Why would it be easier? Well, if France can't get troops or supplies over there to their troops in North America, then the British will be more easily able to defeat them. Okay? That's part of the reason why the North ended up winning the Civil War, is because the North was able to keep the South from, getting supplies from Britain, to, because the North was such an industrial power. So it's kind of an analogous situation here. So Britain had lots of success. They seized lots of territory. They end up capturing Quebec, French forts like Fort Duquesne, which is north of Pittsburgh. I believe that's where George Washington was involved. And again, this is where George Washington kind of develops his military prowess that he'll put to such effect 20 years later in the American Revolution. But the Prussians had it tougher. They're surrounded. Again, you look at the map here, Prussia's in purple. They're surrounded by Sweden, by Russia, by the German states to the west of them, Spain and France. So they're getting ganged up on. Russia, Sweden, most of the German states and Spain joined France and Austria in opposing Russia. Now Frederick, he is a very good. He has a superior army. Remember, it's like 100,000 or something men, and obviously very effective. So he survives because the new leader of Russia comes to the throne and actually likes Frederick II and doesn't necessarily want to keep making war with him. And so this leads us to the Treaty of Hubertusburg. Again, not a decisive victory, but just sort of outlasting your opponents. And in some ways, that's the way Washington wins the Revolutionary War, at least through the first half of it. It's more just about he's able to survive because he's living off of his own land, and the British have a hard time maintaining their army to crush the Americans. So it's kind of a similar thing here. And these groups that were allied against the Prussians end up signing the Treaty of Paris, and this has important consequences. France loses all of its territory in North America. So Now Quebec, even though it's still French speaking, and Canada has two official languages, French and English, right? So you'll learn both of those growing up there. Um, but it all becomes British. That's why when you get, for instance, Canadian currency, whose picture on it? It's Queen Elizabeth's picture on it because it's part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain. And when you go to London, one of the biggest embassies there is the Canadian embassy, as is the Australian embassy, because they're still part of this Commonwealth, the remnants of the British Empire, if you will. So Britain gains all the territory east of the Mississippi, and of course they're colonizing there, and that's all going to become American territory. They lose what they had gained in the previous war in India. Spain loses Florida, but gains New Orleans and Louisiana. Not that they're going to hold that for very long. So England becomes a world power. Again, we're getting to this time period where the sun never sets on the British Empire. They've got territories in the New World, first the American colonies, then Canada. They have territories in Britain. They're going to settle Australia, and Africa, Kenya. So we're moving to this period where especially when we get to the colonial era in the 18th and 19th centuries. So at the end of this time period, here's what we've got. This is the balance of power. And war is going to continue breaking out. So we're just this is just a temporary marking spot after these three conflicts. However, sometimes when you're big enough, you don't have to go to war. You just the threat of war can allow you to accomplish what you want, and that's what we see in the partition of Poland here. They're a large independent nation, but they lack natural boundaries, like rivers and mountains, and so it's difficult to defend. Their government is weak and inefficient, so in other words, like maybe not able to raise an army, not able to have the financial resources to sustain war. And so these bigger powers, these absolutist powers that we've been talking about, are just able to go in and slice up this country through secret negotiation. Prussia, Russia, and Austria, right? These groups that we talked about in section 2 agreed to partition Poland among themselves. And so Poland is no longer an independent country until after World War I. So this lasts for 150 years. So that's what happens with that one. So here's a picture of how this happened. You can see the outlines of the country of Poland. Warsaw is the current capital. Danzig, which has reverted to its Polish name of Gdansk now, but it had a German name, Danzig, until after World War I. So you can see how the eastern part goes to Russia, the western part goes to Prussia, and the southern part goes to Austria, the places that they most closely border. Okay, a little bit of review. What did European monarchs seek to preserve? Starts with a B. The balance of power. Two major events led to the War of Spanish Succession. And again, think of the term succession. So first of all, you had somebody who was trying to succeed, and then you had these other countries joining to stop that. So Louis the 16th, no, that doesn't sound right. I believe it's Louis the 14th. I think there's a mistake here. And then the other European nations don't like this, don't want to see this happen, and so they form this alliance to block this. What country monarch was the pragmatic sanction designed to protect? So this is the War of Austrian Succession. So you can imagine that might be part of the answer. Austria and Marie Theresa, the daughter of, what was he, Charles II? Charles VI, excuse me. The erratic change in alliances during the 7 Years' War called, okay, this was dramatic, so it involves a word that means a dramatic shift. The diplomatic revolution. So again, you had a shifting of alliances. France, that had formerly always been opposed to Austria, is now joining with Austria in order to be able to oppose Prussia. List the 3 countries that divided defenseless Poland. Okay, 2 of them rhyme, right? Prussia, Russia, Austria. Okay, why was the pragmatic sanction unsuccessful? You know, again, they signed this document, but they did not hold to it, right? They violated their oath. So they seized parts of Austria, even though they had said they weren't going to. Analyzed Louis the 14th. There we go. Yeah, Louis the 16th. That's a misprint in the book. So the consequences of wanting to assert yourself and gain more power and extend your territory means you're upsetting the balance. So the other countries want to maintain that balance, so they're willing to go to war to preserve it. All right, for this section, you need to know William and Mary, the end of section 3, Maria Theresa, William Pitt the Elder. Remember, he's the Englishman who decides to give assistance to what country? What was the Glorious Revolution? So Parliament brings in new rulers as opposed to a war. Remember, it was a bloodless revolution. So the Bill of Rights limits the royal power. And again, it's moving more and more toward individual rights and the elected legislature having the power more so than the executive. The Act of Settlement. So again, this is giving Parliament the right to choose the king, or at least give credence to it. The cabinet government, and again, they're more and more going to be the ones who actually have the power. The prime minister, the foreign minister, the minister of treasury, or finances, the finance minister. Okay, the Grand Alliance. This is moving into the last section. So these countries that fought against Louis XIV in the War of Spanish Succession. The Treaty of Utrecht is what resolved it, ended the War of Spanish Succession. The Pragmatic Sanction is where Charles VI of Austria is trying to protect his granddaughter. Was that daughter? Sorry. Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the resolution of this. So status quo ante bellum. So the diplomatic revolution is where you have this shift of alliances because they want to keep Prussia in check. So people that had previously been allied with Prussia now switch. 7 Years' War, Britain and Prussia on one side, France, Russia, and Austria on the other. And by the way, this is, one of the interesting things about, Prussia, Germany, Hanover, is that, we're going to end up seeing kind of a German house become the kings of England. Um, and it's interesting when you look at like Queen Victoria, who of course marries a German herself. She ends up being the grandmother or the great aunt of like both sides of World War One. So this whole notion of royal blood, it's kind of interesting to see how these people don't end up necessarily remaining friends with each other, even though they're in some sense blood relatives. So that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Treaty of Paris is the resolution to the 7 Years' War, which, again, France gives up the New World Territory, etc.